Hello everyone, today we talk about Eurasian steppes warfare during the Mongol period, and actually more broadly between, say, the mid-11th to the mid-14th century and stretching in beyond by a certain degree. And actually, it's not going to be a particularly long video because we still have to talk in detail about the Mongol army, which we'll hopefully do soon and make lots of videos about. Yeah, we discussed them here and there. Last winter made a video about the Mongol invasion of Europe. I think a couple of videos about that. First, in one on Eastern Europe and the other how the Westerners coped with it through a crusade and more. We talked about the Wafidiyya in the Mamluk armies and so on, but these are all relatively tangent and or general topics. In a sense, we really have to get in the thorough details of the military. And in theory, this video is designed also in order to explain like a bit what was the influence of Mongol warfare itself on this wide area of the Eurasian steppes, and also, of course, how the same area, it's even larger than a region practically, and it's even difficult to just put simply some borders like the one of the steppes that within themselves are, by the way, also further more complex than they seem. They had lots of different military cultures, but in fact also the influence that this area received from the external, meaning through those through the Mongols, but from those civilizations that the Mongols had conquered. So it will look mainly at, let's say, technology in part, but also referring at some other broader considerations about the Mongol military that are important to be framed correctly. We made a video about the Karakitai military last year or this year, I don't remember, this winter, I think, that showed, interestingly enough, the degree of commixtion that some Mongol tribes had reached with the Chinese military, right? And something that what we call more superficially the Mongols of Temujin, etc., would, in fact, as we'll see, achieve in the same way. But what is really important to stress is that throughout most of the 12th century, what we call the Mongols were a collection of objectively relatively unimportant and culturally backward people. They were essentially primitive tribes inhabiting the upper reaches of the Onon and the Karelen rivers, and just, the picture geographically is today is essentially northeastern Mongolia, right? The northeastern tip of the Chinese region of Inner Mongolia and the neighboring part of Russia, and the Jinsky-Buryatsky area, both of which lie within the Russian Federation. So they are pretty, just as today and at the time, they were pretty peripheral areas, right? And this is also a very important aspect about the Mongol invasions that should never be forgotten. After all, yes, it was impressive. Genghis Khan's empire was the largest surfacially in the history of mankind, but at the same time, it's a bit like the Arabs of the Caliphate. It's it's not that by conquering an enormous area of the world that those original areas actually changed, benefited, right? They remained pretty much the same, right? And the offspring went on as essentially partly ethnicizing the ruling elite of pre-existing civilizations that were eventually the base on which what we call as also the Mongol successor states were fundamentally installed. But this aspect is very important because it still shows, as many times in history, how more primitive peoples can be more morally driven to achieve things that even the more advanced have lost the drive in doing, right? And we will hopefully look at that better also, because the Western chroniclers at the time understood this, and it's remarkable how did this push from the steppe managed to conquer so much, but also how, after all, in spite of the victories that scored on the battlefields, on all the also the capacity of synthesis, right, and cooptation, etc., the system, and still the empire dissolved, right? And so we have made, again, other videos. I have a medieval Mongolia, or at least, Mongol history playlist that talks also about the successor states on a longer run, even just ideally, right? Like Timur-Lane, in part even the Ottomans. I mean, there was a broader Mongol legacy that had shocked Eurasia, right? And that, as Westerners narrowly meant, we haven't quite made our own, but this broader world at the steppes borders that was quite hybrid in nature, politically, military, and socially, with these models, still resented enormously, of course, of the Mongol time. And just over 50 years after the 12th century, the Mongols formed, in fact, the military and governing elite of a vast empire, to say the least, which, though it was soon to fragment, in fact, into 4 large khanates, covered the entire Eurasian steppes, most of China, Tibet, much of the Siberian forests, the bulk of Russia, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, most of Anatolia, plus many lesser regions. Right? Naturally, the control was largely decentralized, as in all pre-industrial realities, but the Mongol political and strategic projectional capacities were enormous, as much as their deterrent power that they had quite well nurtured with an explicitly and quite functionally terroristic behavior that, especially at the beginning of the conquests, was necessary, and that later on left space naturally for a much more liberal relation with the subjected peoples, and an obvious negotiations, as we will see now. And speaking of the military influence, already here at the broader beginning, we can see how the Mongol military legacy, for how the Mongol warfare had developed actually in the process of this conquest, that was, as we will see, quite radical in practice, are evident, and maintained a century-old legacy that could be seen, at least, up to the some unexpectedly recent times in the even in the outfits, in the armament of these people, that had not really changed much, as we will see, but that still do bear an important mark of the Mongols' passage. Because steppes warfare, we talked about it here and there, but we still have to get into technicalities, had its own evolution, right? From one side, it's important to stress the continuity over time, because after all, the communities that inhabited the steppes, albeit varying, were also quite much less diversified, let's say, than the ones in the more developed world. But at the same time, was an important military engineering occurring that is beautifully reflected just by the technology, the armament, and so on. For example, there is a Mongol Tartar helmet, like we're pinpointing this kind of pretty random examples, but they are important, dating to the late 13th, 14th century. We don't know actually where it comes from, but it's preserved at the Askari Museum in Istanbul, and we probably don't even know how it got there, but it's something that arrived west, right, and represents a new style compared to what would have been the normality of Mongol Tartar archaeology in let's say, Mongol Empire's times, as it's taller, probably it has even a lighter head protection overall, and it does seem to show Far Eastern, Chinese, or even Tibetan influence. It's this blend that also it seems more advanced for its own time. It's probably late 13th, 14th, but it could date even to the 15th, right? In ways that seems the Mongol conquest, even of more developed lands like China, etc., seem to have accelerated dramatically. And as we will see, there are examples about European armor, kind of, we were talking about it just the other day in that video about medieval German warfare, that probably received this injection, stimulating the even the spread of plate armor, as it was something relatively rare, especially among even the peoples of Western Eurasia, the nomads that the Europeans already knew, right? The Russians called our own pagans to distinguish it from the Mongols coming literally from nowhere, from their perspective. And as we were saying before, steppe warfare didn't differ a lot. Like, Mongol armament was not that different originally from the one of Turkic peoples, such as the Khazars, the Pechenegs, or the Kipchaks, right? And some weaponry, for example, dating to the Mongol Golden Horde period, and specifically the late 13th, early 14th century, some spearheads, and for example, do seem very similar to pre-Mongol times, right? Except we can see little differences, such as the spearhead, for example, being broader and having a much filmier socket than most, at least earlier examples. The long hooked spearhead type is also entirely new, seemingly having been brought there by the Far East, right? In fact, some medieval European travelers describe this typology of weapon that certainly reflects Chinese influence in Mongol warfare. And so we see that, of course, there were some concepts, ideas, because how can you make a spear? There are not so many ways, right? How do you make a shield? There are all similar things. Apologically speaking, they all have to do more or less the same thing. But we can trace statistically some variations that are a bit like the trace of the wave of the Mongol conquest, that also, as we will see, among some peoples probably didn't have much influence either, right? The steppes were very wide. Some peoples were literally wiped out by the Mongols. Others just not necessarily resisted the tide, but simply were spared or were too peripheral, or they just simply they cooperated. But back home, right, when they came back from their campaigns as tributary peoples from the Mongol conquest, they wouldn't have the reason to change the local warfare. That in some cases instead did change, or that in some cases was perhaps already very advanced and had within the same steps and had already influenced the primitive root Mongol one. Naturally, the broader political strategic lesson is that you don't need to be technologically advanced to be military successful, right? Technology is the big illusion. It's all about doctrine. It's not that the Mongols didn't top technology, as we know, but at the same time, their effectiveness was not connected with it in a decisive way, and the one of no other peoples, fundamentally. Were just an adaptation to certain specific needs that were presenting after the military had already been largely successful and providing itself with something new that other peoples already had and that they were now capable of integrating within their own system. What would have been the very advanced and sophisticated Mongol siege warfare of the 13th, 14th century in the original homeland, where there were no cities fundamentally. So talking about this is crucial in my opinion. And do not underestimate, in the sense, the Eurasian world of the steppe especially, but properly the Asian world, say more narrowly, but at the same time also compared to the steppes more widely, in the difference that it made from Western warfare in a way. For example, there is a chanfron from Romask near Kiev. This dates to the mid-14th century. It's Turco-Mongol, right? This today is at the Historical Museum of Kiev. And this type of armor. You know that this time in mid-14th century, yes, there was plate armor and already appearing for horses. There are examples of that, like in 12th century Hungary, the Byzantine set, the heavy cavalry having plate frontal chamfrons and also chest plates for the horses, etc. And that is also important, probably evidence of some kind of precocious plate armor, say, habit of equipment in peoples like like the ones inhabiting Hungary, not just the Hungarians, but also the Cumans, etc. Or others that were settled often by the Magyar kings to reinforce their army from the steppes beyond the Carpathians. That also show what's the point of plate armor. Right? Plate armor was always known. The point is, what was the advantage of using it or not? Well, that's the point. In Western Europe, it practically wasn't, right? Virtually wasn't, even though it was not a problem of making it or not. But both Central Asia and the Islamic Middle East had known such horse armor for many centuries, right? And what is particular about the Euromaski chamfron is that this style seems to be more Chinese in origin, if not properly from China, maybe neighboring regions of the eastern steppes, rather than the same Middle East. And this shows also an important Mongol, and even in fact Far Eastern influence in the Old Rus in this case, and at least among the peoples that, like the Turco-Mongols, that were settled at its outskirts and used widely, etc. But also the Eurasians, as you know, were heavily influenced by this warfare later on. Right? Pick up a late medieval Russian horseman. There is absolutely not any kind of difference from a Mongol horseman. Also because they were basically the same people. They married into each other. The Muscovy rose as exclusively because being of a Mongol vassal. So this was deeply, properly injected into some of the local military cultures as well. And there is a boundary, which is the one of the steppes, right? That naturally in this case goes beyond, also partly in the woodland forest, etc. But that pre-existed in a sense, right, in its connection with the Middle East and so on. We explained partly this, especially in that video about medieval Hungarian warfare, how much this, since the Avar times, but also the later Magyars, how much Persian influence they were, and how much the Caspian world, the Middle East, was very much close. And you find the Pannonian Plain into the heart of the Middle Ages still very evident Middle Eastern influences in arms and armor, because the westernmost branches of the Silk Road ended there. It was a florid trade. It's properly another dimension that were not just often popularly paraded, but that existed and that influenced dramatically not just that local warfare, but also the most Western one as well. And as we were hinting at before, during the early stages of their conquests, the Mongols do not appear to have been particularly well armed, right? And in some respects, they were clearly inferior in weaponry to their foes. Nor was Mongol warfare particularly new in the context of the Eurasian steppes, right? They fundamentally relied above all on horse archery and encirclement or harassment tactics. Consider that if you look at, this is in part true for even for medieval Europe in general, like when you look at the, let's say, the heterogeneity of warfare among the various regions, it was practically non-existent. I mean, if you look at the typical Turco-Mongol warfare and equipment, it had largely remained unchanged since the 10th century. The same thing can be said about the medieval knight at that point, right? What's the big difference between 13th and, say, 10th century knightly equipment? Just minor elements. So we're not going to make the story of how and why the Mongol military became, say, because of being their military, the one who made it, right, in taking over most of Eurasia. That we will discuss on another occasion. But it's more important in this sense to properly get rid of any preconception about some magic technical alchemy for which, I don't know, this weapon, this specific tactics, these people were geniuses and all the others were stupid, right? Because this is the standard attitude of to warfare in general, and even more hideously so in the history of the art of war, which should be comparative and diachronic, and evidencing by default, like the ABC of the fact that warfare is dramatically symmetric most of the times, right? By approximation, albeit being always asymmetric, like not being ever asymmetry as we intended in an absolutistic way. Otherwise, there wouldn't be warfare in the first place. But I should come back teaching Clausewitzian theory because I see a complete drift here that is really perilous and ruinous. So, as we've seen also for the tactics of other peoples, the Mongol battle was generally initiated with long-range archery, followed by zone shooting rather than by aiming at individual targets. Naturally, the horse archers were trained to be very proficiently precise shooters, but only for other obediences that could be paradoxically more useful in an ambush, in a small party, right, clashing against another. Whereas in open field, in pitched battles, the standard for any shooter at the time is zone shooting. It's collective. It's about throwing volleys in an orderly as possible. Let's put it in this way, to maximize the relative impact in interest of time on the cohesion of the enemy formation, so that it can be exploited by the shock element. So naturally, this was a combined arms tactics. Javelins or spears were also used when closing with a broken enemy. So naturally, these horsemen were trained and equipped to use a bit all the weapons available that were also pretty simple, as you understand. And of course, hand-to-hand combat was an eventuality also for he who just in that bigger collective system in a pitched battle had the primary function of a horse archer. Because also the enemy was largely, again, was identical, so given that the majority of horsemen were unarmored, still in those situations where it had to close in, they could go at one another without too many problems. Naturally, it was heavy cavalry as well, that instead that's where an unarmored trooper would have not liked to come to grips with. As we will see when talking about the Mongol army organization, there was a pretty sound cohesion, because these peoples, as primitive as they were also very much cohesive. They were warlike peoples, imbued with metus hostilis. They perfectly knew what should be known by any person on this earth, that military effectiveness has to do with political cohesion, primarily. It hasn't to do with technology, it hasn't to do with tactics, just per se. Those are all subordinated to the concept that you must have a moral force driving you, otherwise you go nowhere, right? So this increased collective effectiveness, right? We can't digress on the details, but supposedly there was this, first of all, the Mongol army was well organized and very disciplined already by default. There was an oceanic metaphor almost of the steppes power of these ultra heavy, powerful warlords that had managed to subjugate the other tribes that fought the former fighting on as heavy cavalry and were practically unassailable, if not by their homologues, and the latter being this swarms, this literally sea tides of horse archers that were also pretty well trained on average to perform these collective maneuvers very, very smoothly, very efficiently, etc. And so there was this, in fact, proper title of Oceanic Ruler of the Steppe that was meant to depict this mass, these enormous masses of horsemen as probably as a sea, as a stormy, wavy sea of horsemen. And as we will see, Mongol armies were actually not so huge, mostly in terms of manpower. They were logistically speaking. They had lots of horses. And this influenced dramatically their strategic possibilities, by the way, and that's where you can't properly measure the Mongol moral force, because in order to push through this armies for thousands of kilometers in terrifying terror, you must understand how harsh this men properly were and how habituated even to enormous strains. Of course, their life expectancy was dramatically low, but hell, they gave everything they had in life, physically, mentally, and this was in fact very well documented by other peoples observing their exploit, right? And they had a lot of spare horses on which they literally lived, and they drew everything, most of their even nourishment, etc. But the same horses needed to be nourished, so you could literally just run along certain valleys for feeding them, for making them drink, if anything, just in some moments of the year. So everything was extremely complex and complicated, but these peoples had, in spite of their, again, primitive background, a complete functionalization in this sense, so that they knew perfectly and collectively how to move in this regard, and making things work efficiently through sheer practice, right? Of the supposed division into multiples of 10, 100, 1000 and more. The most unreliable elements of the army were placed in the front or at the center of their battle array, with the best units being stationed on the wings. In part, this was done because of the hail of arrows that would come unavoidably, to fall on the first ranks. But there was another reason, that is the standard, or at least preferred Mongol tactics, the one that also scored some success in the West. Think about the Battle of Lenitsa. It was about refusing the center and enveloping the enemies with the wings, right? And so the center was meant to give way in a kind of faint flight, but not quite so, right? Most pre-programmed routes, people say, this was programmed. Actually, most warfare, these routes were not programmed, meaning that they were actually due to the fact that these elements were given way, right? And just, if you could regroup in the end, which these horsemen were good at doing, because they were quite fast on average, and they it was easier for them to come back in the fight, and also, if anything, just for looting, for taking prisoners and so on, even after they had been knocked out. The fact that most of this warfare was based on horse archery naturally rendered partly these formations much more fluid, right? So there was an enormous variation of types of troops as well. We were just not dramatically documented. It's just the type of steppe warfare that was pretty much similar to one another, right? So, as always, discipline, collective training, leadership make everything all together, and just even if they are perfect individually, this is still not a guarantee of victory alone, because in war there is no such thing by definition. But it was very effective, as it was repeatedly shown against a vast assortment of enemies fought, by the way, on the most diverse type of grounds, climates, etc. There's nothing worse than hearing that Mongols, were stopped in Europe because of humid weather. Yes, as if, maybe campaigning some, in other areas where the Mongols fought was just, everything was dry, right? And no, because it's about the bows. They knew how to keep their bows dry much better than you, right? So, and that has nothing to do with the reasons why they stopped in Europe. In any case, when we look at the broader, quality, let's say the average quality of the Mongol horsemen, it was nothing dramatically impressive. Many warriors reportedly had only inferior bows, of which they carried 2 or 3, with different characteristics, but also just because of the sake of replacement. Arrows, of which each warrior carried up to 60, was very large amount, because battles were basically all about this, and also the general habits of Mongol lifestyle, including hunting, etc., required this massive production of arrows. A Mongol army, in this sense, could shoot literally millions in a single battle, and they were usually kept. The most standard quiver type was the long form, which largely enclosed its arrows practically, and arrows were longer than those used in Europe and had heads of iron, bone, or horn. In any case, there were these varieties. Various specialized arrow heads were also used naturally, and the main problem was targeting the right type of surface, right, and especially when you had to cope with armor. Swords were mostly short, right, light sabers, and were owned by only a few men, relatively. This aspect is debated in a way, because what you notice in over time, not just because of Mongol warfare, let's say, but that the straight type of sword, especially dating from the time of Indo-European dominance of the steppes, was gradually replaced by something smaller and lighter, like and more curved. And there are, apologically, it's difficult to make a cogent, omnicomprehensive assessment, but the idea is that the Turkic and Mongol peoples that eventually came at waves to the Mongols being effectively the last ones historically, came from communities that were much more stratified. Let's say where one guy was just the ultra top rich and that could afford a heavy panoply to master, right? Where all the others, as we've seen, were just lots of basically an armored horseman. Indo-European times saw some different degree of wealth distribution, for which more horsemen also had kind of better equipment, both in arms and armor, and so the idea of this kind of stocky type of more bulky type of sword was more needed to cope against armor. Instead, paradoxically, even this operational kind of locust-like, swarmy and unstable type of of policy and warfare, etc., that followed later, apparently would favor kind of this kind of throwaway type of horseman that would require kind of less training. And lightsabers did require less training. Like, there are some Mongol swords that are impressive. They're like, very long and curved, massive blades, right? That were really meant to inflict dramatic damage and required an enormous training. But most of the troopers would know how to handle this other type of sabers. It's debatable again whether the majority of Mongol horsemen didn't actually use sabers at all. They had some kind of blades anyhow. They all had knives, etc., daggers. The saber, it's debatable, but let's not digress, and this is not really so important. That may be the overall reason of the spread, right? And this reveals naturally also kind of a more collective, however, type of organization, meaning that the more effectively you act from a collective point of view, the least you need, the least individual training. I mean, training devolved to individual combat, right? It's a single man combat you need, because the effectiveness will be to operate collectively. And in great part, in fact, of Mongol effectiveness in open field was about this. Arrows showered by a massive amount of horse archers would have to soften up and to cripple the heavier type of cavalry. Think of even just how delicate a war horse was, right? The ones in the Western raids and feudal warfare, etc. You just don't have this. These arrows mostly tickled you, literally. I mean, especially if you were covered in armor, but also a good padding could be enough to stop successfully most of the arrows. But them all together would still create a very heavy type of impact, right? That is, on the long run, comparable to the one of the same shock charge on which most instead of Western warfare relied on, especially probably the westernmost one. So the odds were pretty balanced in this regard. The point being that Mongols were mostly superior at just sheer experience of campaigns, of peoples that fought on that scale of warfare on a regular basis. Like the Western Knight was the peak of professionalism and was perfectly trained in collective training as well, but in this smaller types of units, right, where gathering heavily armored guys was a very rare, in large numbers was a rare thing, right? Big battles were rare things. Big battles, big campaigns were normal for the Mongols. So the collective training overall was superior, and also the command was much more selected just by practice. So this is really the edge that the Mongols had over the Westerners. That still doesn't mean that they would have always won, and there is a reason also why they stopped in Europe that we discussed in another video, the one about Mongol invasions. We will come back on at some point, because there is not just tactics. And in any case, there were also other type of weapons that tells us that armor was there in consistent measure, because maces and axes used in close combat always show the necessity of breaking through some kind of armor, or at least, mostly to cause a trauma underneath the same armor, right? Which is exactly what these things were designed for. And there was a broader ethos in the Turkic Mongolic world that in part probably was present also among Europeans, because the club is has always been a symbol of command, more because the idea is that the devotee of the military religious system around which the entire world revolved at the time, or all cultures, was about being superior from a moral point of view, in fact. And so the ultimate proof of a young steppe warrior that had to prove his own courage was to literally attack an armored opponent. So he who was a champion most of the times would go in battle armored to say, not hopefully to take him down, but more realistically just to do things that would show the bravery, if not the bravado in a sense, of this young warrior. In fact, for example, even the knotted horse tails were, because usually this men approached the enemy and pulled his horse's tail, or things like this. And it was considered a way of showing off, right? So much that even leaders altogether, this was shown also by the Seljuks, by other peoples that had a very strong Central Asian military tradition, that would go in battle unarmored as military leaders, ideally, because they had to show this pure bravery and moral superiority that armor, in a sense, betrayed, and that had probably something to do with the fact that these peoples were poor on average. So not only, of course, the elite, as in every culture, was more armored, but also probably armor resembled more like those cowardly, sedentary peoples that, yeah, they may be richer, more advanced, but we're better because we're morally superior, right? This was the mentality. Naturally, we're talking about a very archetypal and somewhat idealistic view of the story, because naturally the elite was very armored. But the process of selection, right? This is something you find even in the, in the comitatus, in the Indo-European brotherhoods of military devotees, that, the younger ones were also the poorer, were the least armored, because they had also won less spoils. They had, when they entered the warband, they had to demonstrate the fact that they didn't personally exist anymore, but they were just like an emanation of the deity by simply running naked, very often with this kind of, beast-like mode against enemies. There were also some practical advantages, telling the truth, because lighter and less armored is sometimes better, depending on what you have to do. But let's not digress in this. I talked about this extensively elsewhere in my military historical content. In any case, Mongol commanders were famous, as we were saying before, also for making full use of ruses, feigned retreats, as well as thorough and far-reaching reconnaissance. It was their deal. They had these very flexible armies. They were very skilled in very far, let's say, long-range movements, right, and fast movement, especially for the logistic standards of other peoples, as also their horse breeds were functionalized to that specific effort in very tough environments like deserts, mountains, etc. And there was a millenary culture that had designed that type of warfare. Naturally, as we were saying before, doesn't mean that you will win anyway, or that we will be able to take over any place because of that, because again, no army has that capacity. But you can always try, which is also the capacity that every army has. And an interesting tactic that probably inflated the numbers in the sedentary war chronicles about the enormous numbers of Mongols that actually were very often numerically inferior, telling the truth, to their enemies, was mounting dummies or straw men on the numerous spare mounts that always accompany the Mongol force, thus exaggerating the size of the army. As we were saying, only a small minority of Mongol warriors were armored, at least in metal. There is no doubt that Mongol armor and horse rider, which was made mostly of metal or hardened leather lamellae, however, gave far better protection against arrows than did mail, and there is a lot of technological development in that in the steppe. There's a debate regarding the anti-arrow armor capacities, and it's a very complex topic. It doesn't have just to do with whether it's mail or lamellar armor, scale armor, whatever. It's a more complex thing that actually has to do with how many troops, first of all, are protected with that, because otherwise, who cares if that makes the war, but you don't have the money to make the difference overall, that to equip everybody with that, or by burdening dramatically also the logistics system, etc. So these are wargamistic problems that have no attendance to reality, right? In war, most of what it works is what is good enough, or what makes the thing by a satisfactory degree, just. And just as I was saying before, you may not necessarily want heavier, better armored troops, especially if they have to be mobile, right? And very often, archery, that volume of fire, the amount of those horse archers was the best defense for themselves. Like if you wonder how would they, in a warfare dominated by hails of arrows, why would the majority of these archers were unarmored? Well, of course, because what mattered was the mass, the volume of fire. If one unit could deliver more firepower, it could shoot the enemy, inflicting damages without essentially suffering others on their own, right? Whereas maybe our heavy cavalry that is not archery functional, say, will just sit there taking hits, right? Maybe we'll take them better because it's better armor, but maybe it's not going to be overall in the balance the best thing you can do. And that's why you need always that kind of archer. So if your volume of fire is greater, you're better protected. That's your shield, that's your armor, right? Also, shields for this reason were quite small, right? They were made of spiral cane construction and used in close combat rather than as defense against archery, right? Just as something for carrying the saber heads and just in very quick dynamic type of fighting, which was also the case, however, for the heavily armored that required less shield in the first place, like was shrinking in the West at the increase of armor, as you know. On the other hand, it's important to notice that even armored Mongols often left their backs unprotected. This may have been due properly to the necessity, simply an ergonomic necessity. I mean, you want to, hopefully, like if you have to turn your back, you're a coward, culturally speaking, but also it means that most is lost in the battle as well. So these were also the heavily armored guys, and they didn't have too much chances of running away, considering all the swarms of lighter ones that existed out there. So it may be a reason to just you want a frontal employment. Otherwise, it's even useless to run away. Could be an idea. And simply, just for that, for functionalizing the fight, towards the front, unavoidably you want it to be lighter in the back. And this does also talk for the heavier horsemen of a compact, thickly compact formation, something that, again, was effective as long as it was collectively trained and united, just like the Western convoy, and that was all for them too. And they definitely shock charged like hell, but could reflect still the overload of frontal protection due to the arrows, hails, right? That would need to unbalance compared to Western armor, where this thing is basically never shown. The necessity of a frontal, an increase in frontal protection with a decrease in the rear, that would simply counterbalance the dual weight and cost and so on. And lamellar cuirasses also invariably left the armpits exposed when a man was shooting. So it was a vulnerable spot, but hey, mobility also comes before defensive protection, because that mobility can provide you with an active defense instead. So everything that is used in warfare does have a functional practice. There is a very interesting found today kept at the Dairy Museum in Debrecen in Hungary of probable, we don't understand it clearly, but these were probably shoulder plates of actually Pechenek or Kipchak, that is Turkic origin, dating to the 13th century. 13th century, so the same moment in which these peoples were actually fleeing from the Mongols and reversing themselves, especially in Hungary, that used them as auxiliaries and even to counterbalance the power of the local ethnic Magyar nobility. And these pieces, by the way, there is a doubt also, a legitimate doubt of whether they were Pecheneг or part of the partially Europeanized Kipchak successor of theirs. In any case, they are very advanced for 13th century warfare, right? And the fact that these peoples had migrated into Hungary and eventually even fought against the Mongols and other foes may display a major influence on the development of plate armor in the same 13th and 14th century Europe, right? You know that that plate armor first appears in what we call Western warfare, at least in an homogeneous and documentable way, in Eastern Germany, on the Alp frontier with Poland, the same one that actually where the Mongols struck. Then it spread immediately all over Europe because evidently Western panoply that was becoming all practically identical everywhere already necessitated that, so it would have happened anyway. But the fact that it first appeared this Eastern frontier that per se was not, necessarily the most advanced. I mean, yes, the Germans also in these had quite advanced metallurgic capacities, but there is no specific reason why it should have started there. One doesn't count the Mongol tide that arrived at the gates of Germany and Italy, and you find there, in fact, we made a video about, again, the crusade that the Europeans planned against the Mongols there. There was a very heavy involvement of Frederick II and all these things. And it could as well be because we see among other peoples, this is an interesting example from the 13th century, from 13th century Hungary, from some Kipchak or Pecheneг. But there is also, for example, the Polish belt that is organic, that is something that remained traditional in Polish equipment, is documented for later times, still used in the 18th century wars of Polish partition and so on, and beyond. That was very much like the same design of plate armor, essentially around the abdomen, right? That is also this more enveloping, kind of made to protect from different sides, which again, with this enveloping Mongol wings, look at what happened to the Germans and the Poles at Lenitsa. The top Mongol tactics there used to bloody effect would require this protection a bit from every side, especially for these peoples that were not habituated to the same Mongol tactics to replicate. And so it's possible that this had already developed exactly to counter this more kind of steppe type of warfare, especially its firepower. And it's possible, naturally, this type of plate armor, as we've seen before, had developed already in outside of Europe, but we find it importantly spreading at the same time in the Mongol conquest, and even from peoples that were fleeing from them, right? So that's how Mongol warfare contributed to the same development of Western armor, for that matter, partly because it would have again happened anyway, but still. Also, we find from completely different direction of Europe some pieces of plate or scale armor from the Yenisei, of Eurasia, of the Yenisei River area from the 13th, 14th century. There are at the local Lower Museum of Abakan Kavkaz in Russia. And these items are probably of Kyrgyz origin, actually, demonstrating the degree of sophistication in the design of armor, which perhaps even surpassed the Western one, but was quite advanced during the period, right? And what is more interesting about this is that this specific area was considered, in general, isolated, right? But in reality, probably very much in trading contact with China during medieval times, and where surely part of some influences came as well. So you find islands here we're talking about Kyrgyz, so not Mongols even, right? But we find certain islands where there's not the only one. We'll see later something else that were already pretty advanced on their own for other reasons, because they were in part more, I don't know, more sedentarized, more stabilized, more trade-oriented peoples that could again increase that stability, that level of armoredness, and individual, kind of some greater amount of protection distribution, given the nature of their political social balance, differently from the most hierarchically and elitistic steppes overlords like the Mongol Empire would become, at least as long as it remained kind of as a type in the steppe. And that shows how armor, can be made by those who have the reasons for making it, right? It's not something overwhelmingly complicated in that context where still everybody has to care about war after all. And so even if the metallurgical capacities were very advanced for the times being, still everybody could do that if it was convenient. And it's obvious that even in their home territory of Mongolia, the Mongols were soon influenced by the more advanced technologies of what they conquered. Already before that, there was Christianity, Islam, Buddhism spreading in the Mongol world, famously enough. And so with that, all notions and contacts and ideas and, trade goods, being shared and so on. In Europe, we know that some of the Mongol elite used captured Western equipment, which is obvious. That happens every freaking where, right? And surely some European knight, we don't have an evidence of that, but surely captured at some point. It happened on the frontier. There were also some defeats, for example, in Austria, etc. Some Mongol armor, and probably wore it in battle as well. I mean, that's practically certain. We just don't have the evidence explicitly, but it's pretty obvious that it happened. And most of the armor that the Mongols would use from defeated enemies, that are not just Europeans, but kind of basically from any other people they encountered, were mostly male, to be worn beneath their lamellar armor. They probably relied the most on, this is also what Eastern European armor, if we can define it as such, what was about, right? It was the Epilorikion, for example, in the Byzantine case, that was wearing multiple layers of metal armor, even, or just for the ultra heavy cavalry. But still, this was something in the steppes because of the aforementioned, say, risk-free, allegedly, but not fully, right? Anti-arrow kind of protection. And we know, of course, of local troops hired. We know of European mercenaries recruited by the Mongols. We know properly of individuals that had served. We know of an Englishman, for example, had served the Mongols in Europe and then came back, this kind of things. In the late 13th and early 14th century, also we have a major regional context to analyze in quite detail. That is the Mongol Ilkanade of Iran, that disposed of a series of arsenals locally established by the same Mongols, but probably having to do with previous availabilities of the Persian communities, that reinforce, in fact, the influence of traditional Iranian arms and armor in later Mongol armies. And this would be ever more evident also after the disgregation of the Mongol Empire that occurred more or less in the same time. As we were saying before, there's this Mongolized elite that rules over pre-existing basins of power, say, of demographic and agricultural resources. And we can see a double thread influence For example, there are some weapons found in various sites of Kazakhstan and neighboring regions around the same 13th, 14th century. And the only weapon here which differs from the equipment of earlier nomadic Turkic and also Mongol peoples is the large curved dagger, right? And we don't clearly understand whether this was a Mongol loan or rather an Islamic Middle Eastern one, right? And the question, especially at this chronological point, is a non-problem because the Mongols had already spread there, right? So they had already absorbed an important amount of local hardware, and Kazakhstan was historically already connected with the Middle East. Were already influences from there, as we were saying before, also leaving traces in peoples that passed from there and that settled in Europe eventually, such as the Magyars, etc. So this is quite exemplificative of what we're saying. One of the few Turkic nomadic peoples to survive the Mongol onslaught relatively unscathed were the poor and backward Bashkirs, and they, in their case, there is apparently no change in equipment, and we have an important amount of Bashkir weaponry archaeologically available, and we see, from the time we see in that case they probably exactly because they weren't much of a sophisticated developed people, they still were good with what they had for what was needed to them. We find also regarding the aforementioned local influence on Mongol customs, especially from iconographic evidence of 14th century manuscripts from Iran and Iraq, some illuminations there, a type of helmet that is extremely similar to a find in the Altai Mountains, probably Naiman, dating to the 14th century. It's the local lore museum in Biysk in the Altai district in Russia, and which suggests probably some kind of real standardization from the side of Mongol armies in the broader Central Asian area that could have come again from this more kind of structurally, systemically organized arms and armor production in places like Iran, especially part also the Jazeera in a sense that was, however, more kind of like a frontier with the Mamluks, and that is made up by essentially a cap, right, and a small ring on its lower edge that may have been for earpieces that, however, not been found. So it's probable that they could be made of hardened leather, which eventually rotted away. But this speaks naturally of the important change that had occurred in Mongol warfare since tribal times to the empire, where this Mongol successor states were actual states and had a completely different supplying system compared to the pretty much homemade or handmade in the wild traditional Mongol one. So we're talking about radical differences of radically different regional contexts, lifestyles, political and social forms, and military organization that render practically impossible even to make sense of this video, because you understand how much should be covered, right? We just go, however, by hints. This one seemed pretty good. There is a helmet from Staritskaya, Nakhodka in western Siberia, dating to the 14th century, which is a very sophisticated piece of metalwork that none of the local Turkic, Mongol, or Ugrian people of western Siberia seem to have possessed at this time. So it was probably an import from some more advanced area, but it had reached those wilder places probably because of a Mongol import, because this army is also traveling thousands of kilometers across Eurasia just to the Kuraltai, back and forth from the periphery in the provinces, and ending up, say, scattering this hardware for the most unlikely reasons. There's a saber from the Kuban region of the Caucasus. This is surely a Turkic-Mongol hardware dating to the 14th century. This area was dominated by the Golden Horde at the time, and it's a sharply curved blade tapering regularly almost to a point that was typical at that point, kind of most of the Eurasian steppes finds throughout the 14th century onwards. It was probably a specific Mongol trace left in this broader area. We find also arrowheads and sabers from Ukraine and southern Russia, also coming likely from the Mongol Khanate of the Golden Horde or its tributaries dating to the 14th century, which also show actually little change from pre-Mongol period, but still the adoption, as an exception, of a narrower and more curved saber that again seems to have been brought by that major, probably, saber employment that we were discussing before in its collective raison d'être. And as it's renowned, after the construction of their empire, the Mongols had become dramatically advanced in siege warfare. They made large use of mangonels, and already probably from a traditional standpoint, we've seen the Karakitai were already using Chinese artillerymen and military engineers in general. And in fact, it's the adoption of the Chinese counterweight trebuchet that seemingly, however, arrived from the Islamic world to the same China in early medieval times, and through which they could conquer some of the largest cities of the time. Think about the Chinese capitals, or Baghdad was eventually razed to the ground. Also, some of the most impervious citadels, strongholds. Think about the one of the Ismailites at Alamut, and the large frame-mounted crossbows, siege towers, mining, liquid fire, and even the diversion of rivers are all well-recorded techniques and practices of the Mongol military. And speaking of that, we have archaeological evidence of the giant arrows, probably Mongol, dating to the 13th and 14th century, some of which are stored at the Kremlin armory in Moscow, that was found in the ruined fortifications of the Eurasian city of Vladimir at the time, and quite likely was shot by sophisticated Mongol siege engines, a siege engine operated habitually by the Chinese engineer auxiliaries that, however, surely taught the same Mongols by some extent to create and operate this machinery on their own. The Eurasian defenders were probably too backward to have made use of this artillery. I mean, surely they were present, but it's more likely that it was the Mongols that in this occasion made a tempest of this kind of arrows that in this case were approximately 2 meters long, right, and made of one piece of iron. The flights have been beaten from the iron of the shaft, and it was probably able, as we will see now, also to hinge some kind of explosive. In fact, apart from using traditional fire weapons such as liquid fire, the Mongols also learned how to use gunpowder from their Chinese enemies. And the Chinese notoriously made a less explosive and more incendiary mixture of sulfur and saltpeter with the prevalence of the former, for reasons that have probably to do with the type of targets that were more likely to be hit by these devices in China rather than in Europe, where, as you know, the explosive dimension was kind of more immediately absorbed, and making use of properly grenades, right? So this could come in the form, first of all, of rockets, or at best grenades, and not as means much of firing a projectile from a cannon, of which we have, of course, evidence in the Mongol armies, especially from China, and later, successor states. And we know it was pretty standard for the Mongols, as basically accounts from all the extremities of the lands that they attacked, from Hungary in 1241 to Japan in 1274 to 1281, record these explosives. We have some archaeological evidence from uncertain times. There is the State Historical Museum of Moscow, for example, a so-called grenade that in ceramic that, however, we're not sure of properly being such a device. It's of Turkic-Mongol origin, dating from also the 13th to the 15th century, so we're pretty uncertain. And in the latter and chronologically, artillery was much more advanced than before. And the main question regarding this piece is that the such crudely made pottery container was probably not to explode, right? The construction is too strong, right? They would have not bursted or exploded on impact, right? Quite likely, since proper gunpowder, if we date it, especially to the 13th century, would not become available in the standard we mostly think of by the mid-14th century instead. So it's more likely to have contained some combustible that, when burning, could project a jet of fire through the narrow orifice, both during the flight in the air, and then when impacting on whatever, think about Russian cities made up of straw, wood, whatever. It was relatively easy to set on fire large areas through these projectiles. And as we were saying before, it's likely this kind of projectiles were attached actually to a javelin or a large arrow that could be then shot from a frame-mounted crossbow. The arrow, which we were talking about before, pretty big stuff. And we have evidence of ceramic grenades from also Verni Bezirk, dating to the 14th, 15th centuries, of Turkic-Mongol origin, that is dated for 14th, 15th century. We're more sure it being some form of grenade or fire weapon. And they are still made of pottery, and they are particularly significant as perhaps a wooden shaft was passed through the central hole of this grenade, the whole device eventually being shot from some large artillery, as we were seeing before, probably some frame-mounted siege bow. So this can be a sort of introductory picture to the area and the various influences, at least in exemplary dynamic, that characterized, in fact, the Eurasian steppes during the Mongol period. We will surely talk about Mongol military history soon. Again, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.